Another top Trump administration official will be testifying today before the January 6th committee. This time, it is the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. CNN's Sarah Murray, she's tracking this for us at this hour. Sarah, what are you hearing about Pompeo's testimony and what could be going over?
Well, he is expected to appear today, and obviously he held significant positions in the Trump administration as the former CIA director, leading the State Department. But one of the things that they have really focused on with these high-ranking officials is what the discussions were around January 6th and afterwards, particularly about the 25th Amendment. This move to potentially try to oust Donald Trump from the White House. That is one of the things that they've really wanted to get to the bottom of with some of these high-ranking officials who, frankly, had a lot of concern after what they saw on January 6th. We know that a handful of high-ranking officials have already spoken with the committee. Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary. We know they spoke to Mick Mulvaney, who was a special envoy to Northern Ireland, and he resigned after January 6th. We know they spoke to Eugene Scalia, who was the Labor Secretary. And even highlighted some of his testimony in their hearings of him explaining to Donald Trump that he thought that the former president should concede after he lost. So I think that's what they really want to try to get to the bottom of with Mike Pompeo, what the sentiment was around January 6th and afterwards and what the concerns were.
Absolutely. It's good to see you, Sarah. Thank you so much for that. Back with me now, Caitlin Collins, Paul Callan, and CNN's Dana Bash. Dana, focusing in on the Trump cabinet, and as Sarah was laying out specifically on the conversations around the 25th Amendment, what does that tell you about where the committee is, what path the committee is headed down now as it's now kind of entering this next chapter?
Well, so much of what we've seen is about connecting the dots and giving new information and testimony about what actually happened in the past on January 6th and what it means for Donald Trump as a president then. Looking at the 25th Amendment and the notion that some of his cabinet members were effectively thinking about or talking about the idea that he was so dangerous that they should invoke something that has not been and get rid of him right then and there is a question of looking ahead. It's a question of looking ahead to whether or not he should be president again. It's also for history's sake, but it's because they understand that this isn't just history, this is about the future.
Yeah, and Caitlin, also being brought before the committee now is the current Republican nominee running for governor in Pennsylvania, Doug Mastriano. He's giving an interview with the committee as well. I mean, we'll see what, if anything, that he, says and gives to the committee, but what are the chances that he tries to use this to his advantage in a race where he needs a Trump base to turn out in a big way, kind of jumping off our conversation in the last block?
Well, it didn't appear that appearance by Doug Mastriano really yielded much information because, of course, our colleagues had been reporting, Sarah and Zach, about the idea that he wasn't expected to say much because there was a huge disagreement over how that interview was being conducted. Mastriano wanted it videotaped, so he had his own recording and own accounting of what happened in that interview, which is typically done behind closed doors. And we know the committee itself has been taping them, as we've seen from many of the hearings that have been airing. But it appears they could not come to an agreement on that front. But I do think there are a lot of questions for Mastriano that the committee likely had about, of course, the efforts that he spearheaded to try to overturn the election. Remember, there was that hearing that he held just a few weeks after the election had ended. He helped charter buses to the January 6th rally at the Capitol, at the Ellipse, and then also he was in charge for technically a little bit of the audit that they were conducting. I use audit in quotation marks, of course, since they said that there was no fraud, that widespread fraud that happened there. And I think that just shows, though, the level of how widespread this is, that these are Trump allies, not just people like Mike Pompeo and those who were in the cabinet at the time, but it's also these officials who were spread out throughout states who have a lot of sway and significance when it comes to whether or not they cast doubt publicly on the results of an election.
Yeah, and speaking of another investigation underway, Paul, in Georgia, Rudy Giuliani is now asking to postpone his testimony to the Georgia grand jury investigating 2020 election interference. What do you think he's going at here?
Well, I think that this Georgia investigation is very dangerous to Giuliani, and I think it's also very dangerous to President Trump. This is the investigation that seems to be the farthest along in its development, and Giuliani's just trying to stall the investigation, I think, and push it off as far as possible.
We'll see how much benefit that brings him. Dan, also, as first reported on CNN in another wrinkle of the January 6th committee, 2 years worth of text messages from the conspiracy theorist Alex Jones. They've just been turned over to the committee. What are you hearing about this? I mean, what new avenue could this potentially open up for the committee?
It's about planning. Alex Jones went before the committee and didn't say anything. He invoked his Fifth Amendment rights, so it doesn't seem like they got much from him in their interview. This is a treasure trove, potentially, if he has 2 years worth of text and there is a fair amount dealing with January 6th, or even just a little bit dealing with January 6th. We know his role because we've heard it publicly. He was very open about it on his various media platforms, his role in stoking and encouraging the insurrection. He was there, he didn't go into the building, but he was very much part of amplifying what was going on.
And Paul, this is so unusual about this situation in particular is that how this came about is the attorney for the Newtown families who just won a civil suit against Jones. This attorney is the person who is turning over these text messages over to the committee. Jones's legal team tried to actually stop that from happening, asked the judge to have the material destroyed, and the judge said in response, "I'm not standing between you and Congress," to the attorneys. What do you think of that?
It was a very unusual ruling by the judge. Usually when materials have been accidentally disclosed to the other side, this happens all the time in big lawsuits where somebody sends a trove of documents that was sent in mistake. Usually the court will issue a protective order saying, don't publicize this until we straighten out and go through the material you should have received, as opposed to the attorney-client privilege materials. This judge, though, I think is so fed up with what went on at that trial by the defense, she said, I don't care. Turn it over to Congress. And it is a treasure trove, and if it ties Alex Jones to Donald Trump, that's going to be a big development in these hearings going down the road. That tragedy in Sandy Hook, you'll never get that out of the minds of voters across America.
No, how it came about is very interesting, and I thought the judge's move there was interesting as well. It's good to see you guys.